At the height of the Roman Empire, when its influence stretched across vast territories and its authority shaped the lives of millions, Rome stood not only as a center of power, but as a symbol of civilization itself, a city of grandeur, ambition, and relentless political maneuvering, where the pursuit of dominance often came at a cost measured in blood, betrayal, and calculated decisions made behind closed doors. And it was within this environment, where loyalty was fragile and power was everything, that one of the most controversial figures in history would rise, a young man whose name would become inseparable from both artistic ambition and accusations of tyranny, a ruler remembered not only for what he did, but for what people believed he represented, a figure surrounded by contradictions, myths, and enduring fascination. This was Nero, the fifth emperor of Rome, a man whose life would unfold as a complex narrative of influence, transformation, excess, and ultimately collapse. And to understand how Nero became one of the most debated figures of the ancient world, it is necessary to begin long before the fire that would define his legacy, long before the stories of madness and cruelty took shape, and instead look at the circumstances of his birth, his upbringing, and the forces that shaped his early years, because Nero was not born into power in a straightforward way, but rather into a network of influence that would gradually pull him toward the center of the empire. Born in the year 37 AD under the name Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero entered a world already defined by political intrigue, as a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family that had established itself at the very core of Roman authority, tracing its lineage back to Augustus, the first emperor, whose legacy still cast a long shadow over Rome. And yet, despite this prestigious heritage, Nero's position at birth did not guarantee his future as emperor, because succession in Rome was rarely simple or predictable, often determined not by clear lines of inheritance, but by alliances, adoptions, and strategic decisions made by those in power. And in Nero's case, no figure would prove more influential than his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman whose intelligence and ambition would play a decisive role in shaping his destiny. As she navigated the complexities of Roman politics with remarkable skill, determined not only to secure her own position, but to elevate her son to the highest level of power within the empire. Agrippina's path to influence was neither accidental nor passive, as she understood the dynamics of the imperial court and the importance of proximity to the emperor, and following a series of political shifts, she made a bold and controversial move by marrying her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius, a decision that, while shocking even by Roman standards, positioned her at the center of authority. And through this marriage, she gained the opportunity to promote Nero as a legitimate successor, carefully orchestrating his rise by persuading Claudius to adopt him as his heir, a move that placed Nero ahead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, effectively altering the line of succession. And while such a decision may have appeared to be based on political reasoning, it also reflected the influence Agrippina held over the emperor, influence that would soon prove decisive in determining the future of Rome. The circumstances surrounding Claudius's death in 54 AD remain one of the many uncertainties in Roman history, as ancient sources suggest the possibility of poisoning, with suspicion often directed toward Agrippina herself, though definitive proof has never been established. And yet, regardless of the exact cause, the outcome was clear. Claudius's death created a sudden shift in power, and at just 16 years of age, Nero was declared emperor, ascending to a position that carried immense responsibility, authority, and expectation. And despite his youth, his early reign did not immediately reflect the instability or excess that would later define his rule. Instead, the initial years of Nero's leadership were marked by a degree of stability and measured governance, largely influenced by two key figures, Agrippina and Seneca, the latter being a respected philosopher and advisor who played a crucial role in guiding Nero's decisions during this formative period. Under their influence, Nero's administration adopted policies aimed at maintaining balance within the empire, implementing reforms that sought to address economic concerns, improve the judicial system, and reduce certain tax burdens, actions that contributed to a perception of competence and moderation. And during this phase, Nero appeared to embody the qualities expected of a Roman emperor, demonstrating an awareness of governance and a willingness to listen to experienced advisors, leading. Some historians to later describe these early years as a period of relative prosperity and effective leadership, and yet beneath this surface of stability, tensions were beginning to emerge, particularly in the relationship between Nero and his mother, as the balance of influence that had initially supported his rule began to shift. Agrippina, who had played such a central role in securing Nero's position, expected to maintain a significant degree of control over his decisions, effectively ruling through him. But as Nero grew older and more confident in his authority, he began to resist her involvement, seeking independence from her influence, and this shift marked the beginning of a power struggle that would have profound consequences, as disagreements escalated into mutual distrust, with Agrippina allegedly exploring alternative options for succession, including the possibility of supporting Britannicus as a rival claimant to the throne, a development that would have posed a direct threat to Nero's position. And in response, Nero took decisive action, ordering the elimination of Britannicus, who died under circumstances widely believed to involve poisoning, thereby removing a potential competitor and consolidating his control over the empire. The removal of Britannicus did not resolve the underlying conflict between Nero and Agrippina, however, as their relationship continued to deteriorate, evolving into a situation defined by suspicion and tension, and over time, Nero began to perceive his mother not only as an overbearing presence, but as a potential threat to his authority, a perception that would ultimately lead to one of the most controversial decisions of his reign, because rather than attempting reconciliation or compromise, Nero chose to eliminate the source of conflict entirely, initiating a series of attempts to remove Agrippina from the political landscape, attempts that would become infamous for their complexity and dramatic nature. According to historical accounts, Nero initially sought to carry out this objective through subtle means, attempting to poison Agrippina on multiple occasions, but these efforts failed, either due to her suspicion or the possibility that she had developed resistance to such methods, leading Nero to pursue more elaborate strategies, including the construction of a specially designed vessel intended to collapse and sink while at sea, thereby ensuring her death would appear accidental. And yet, even this plan failed, as Agrippina survived the incident by swimming to safety, an outcome that forced Nero to abandon indirect methods altogether, and ultimately, he ordered her execution directly, bringing an end to the life of the woman who had played such a pivotal role in his rise to power, an act that not only shocked Roman society but also marked a turning point in Nero's reign. Following Agrippina's death, Nero's rule began to change in noticeable ways, as the removal of her influence allowed him greater freedom in his decisions, but also removed a stabilizing force that had previously moderated his behavior, and in the years that followed, Nero increasingly distanced himself from traditional expectations of leadership, showing a growing interest in artistic pursuits, particularly music, poetry, and theatrical performance, activities that, while not inherently unusual, were considered inappropriate for someone in his position, as Roman cultural norms placed a strong emphasis on dignity and authority for those in power, and Nero's willingness to perform publicly challenged these expectations, drawing criticism from the elite and raising questions about his priorities as emperor. At the same time, Nero began to organize elaborate public events, including games, performances, and spectacles that were designed to entertain the population, often featuring exotic animals, staged battles, and theatrical displays. And while these events were popular among the general public, they also required significant financial resources, placing strain on the empire's economy and contributing to growing dissatisfaction among the political class, particularly within the Senate, which viewed such expenditures as excessive and irresponsible, and this divergence in perception, where Nero was seen as generous and entertaining by some, and wasteful and erratic by others, would become a defining aspect of his reputation. As Nero's reign continued, his personal life also became a subject of scrutiny, marked by a series of relationships and decisions that further complicated his public image, including his marriage to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, which was initially intended to strengthen his claim to the throne, but later ended in divorce and her subsequent execution, an event that generated significant controversy and contributed to the perception of Nero as a ruler willing to act decisively, even ruthlessly, in matters of personal and political importance, and this pattern would continue in his later relationships, reinforcing the idea that Nero's actions were increasingly driven by impulse and personal desire rather than calculated governance. By the time Nero had firmly established his independence as ruler, the foundations of his later reputation had already begun to take shape, characterized by a combination of ambition, artistic expression, and controversial decision-making, and while the full extent of his transformation into the figure remembered by history had yet to unfold, the events of his early life and reign had set the stage for what was to come, a period marked by escalating tensions, dramatic events, and ultimately, one of the most significant disasters in Roman history, an event that would forever link Nero's name to fire, destruction, and one of the most enduring questions of the ancient world, because as Rome continued to grow and evolve, so too did the challenges facing its emperor, challenges that would soon culminate in a moment of crisis that would test not only Nero's leadership, but also the stability of the empire itself. As Nero's reign progressed and his personal authority became increasingly absolute, the fragile balance that once sustained his government began to deteriorate, and while outwardly Rome continued to function as the center of an immense and powerful empire, beneath the surface tensions were accumulating, shaped by economic strain, political dissatisfaction, and a growing perception that the emperor was becoming detached from the responsibilities of leadership, and it was within this atmosphere of instability that one of the most catastrophic events in Roman history would occur, and that would not only devastate the city physically, but would also transform Nero's legacy in ways that would endure for centuries, because in the summer of 64 AD, a fire broke out in Rome, beginning in the southeastern region near the Circus Maximus, an area filled with shops and storage facilities containing highly flammable goods, and due to the structure of the city itself, with its narrow streets, densely packed buildings, and widespread use of wood in construction, the flames spread rapidly, moving through neighborhoods with little resistance, consuming homes, businesses, and public spaces, while the dry summer conditions intensified the destruction, turning what might have been a contained incident into a full-scale disaster. The fire raged for days, reportedly lasting 6 days and 7 nights, and even after it was brought under temporary control, it reignited, continuing to destroy additional parts of the city, and by the time it was finally extinguished, the damage was immense, with large portions of Rome reduced to ruins, entire districts obliterated, and thousands of residents left without shelter, their lives permanently altered by the devastation, and in the immediate aftermath, the city was transformed into a landscape of smoke, ash, and destruction, where once thriving areas had been replaced by charred remains and uncertainty about the future, and it was in this moment of crisis that the actions of Nero would come under intense scrutiny, because although he was not present in Rome when the fire began, having been in the nearby town of Antium, he returned to the city as soon as he was informed of the situation, and according to several historical accounts, he took measures to assist the population, opening public buildings, including his own gardens, to provide shelter for those displaced, and organizing the distribution of food supplies to prevent widespread famine. Despite these efforts, rumors began to circulate almost immediately, fueled by fear, anger, and the human tendency to seek explanations in times of disaster. And among these rumors was the claim that Nero himself had ordered the fire, either as an act of madness, artistic inspiration, or as part of a deliberate plan to clear space for ambitious construction projects. And while there is no definitive evidence to confirm such accusations, they gained traction, particularly among those who were already critical of Nero's leadership, and the situation was further complicated by the fact that following the fire, Nero initiated a series of reconstruction efforts that included not only practical improvements, such as wider streets and regulations on building materials to reduce the risk of future fires, but also the construction of a grand and highly controversial project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, an enormous palace complex that extended across a significant portion of the city. Featuring luxurious architecture, artificial lakes, elaborate decorations, and innovations that reflected Nero's personal taste and vision. The scale and extravagance of the Domus Aurea shocked many Romans, particularly the elite, who viewed it as a symbol of excess and self-indulgence, especially given that it was built in the aftermath of a disaster that had left so many citizens homeless, and this perception contributed to the growing belief that Nero had something to gain from the fire, reinforcing suspicions about his possible involvement, even if those suspicions were never proven. And faced with increasing criticism and unrest, Nero sought to redirect public anger, and in doing so, he targeted a group that was already marginalized within Roman society, the Christians, accusing them of having started the fire as part of a destructive movement against Rome, an accusation that lacked solid evidence but served a political purpose, as it provided a scapegoat for the disaster and shifted attention away from the emperor. The consequences of this decision were severe, as it led to one of the earliest and most brutal persecutions of Christians in Roman history, with individuals being arrested, tortured, and executed in ways that were intended not only as punishment but also as public spectacle, and accounts describe victims being subjected to extreme forms of execution, including being burned alive, crucified, or used as human torches to illuminate imperial gardens at night, acts that demonstrated both the cruelty of the repression and the extent to which Nero was willing to use violence as a means of control. And while these actions may have temporarily reduced the pressure on him, they also contributed to the long-term perception of Nero as a tyrant, a ruler whose decisions were increasingly driven by fear, paranoia, and the need to maintain authority at any cost. At the same time, Nero's focus on artistic expression and personal ambition continued to shape his behavior, as he devoted more time to performances, competitions, and cultural pursuits, often prioritizing these interests over administrative duties, and in doing so, he further alienated the Roman elite, who expected the emperor to embody traditional values of discipline, leadership, and military strength, and instead saw a ruler who appeared more interested in public applause than in governance. And this growing disconnect between Nero and the political establishment created an environment in which opposition could begin to form, as dissatisfaction spread among senators, officials, and provincial leaders who felt increasingly marginalized and burdened by the consequences of Nero's policies. One of the most significant manifestations of this opposition came in the form of the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot organized by a group of senators and other influential figures who sought to remove Nero from power and restore what they viewed as a more stable and traditional form of governance. And while the conspiracy represented a serious threat, it ultimately failed, as it was discovered before it could be carried out, leading to a harsh and widespread crackdown, in which those involved were arrested and forced to take their own lives, including Seneca, Nero's former advisor, whose death marked the end of one of the last connections to the earlier, more moderate phase of Nero's reign. And with each such event, Nero's rule became more isolated, more dependent on fear, and more detached from the structures that had once supported it. In the years that followed, Nero's actions continued to reflect a pattern of extravagance and detachment, as he embarked on a journey to Greece, where he participated in various artistic and athletic competitions, presenting himself not only as a patron of the arts but as a performer in his own right, and while he was declared the winner in numerous events, often under circumstances that raised questions about fairness and authenticity, these activities did little to address the growing problems within the empire, and instead reinforced the perception that Nero was more concerned with personal recognition than with the responsibilities of leadership, a perception that would have significant consequences as unrest continued to grow. Meanwhile, the financial strain caused by Nero's spending, combined with the costs of rebuilding Rome and maintaining his lavish lifestyle, led to increased taxation and economic pressure, particularly in the provinces, where local populations and governors began to express dissatisfaction with the central authority, and this discontent eventually escalated into open rebellion, as leaders in various regions challenged Nero's rule, signaling a breakdown in the unity and stability that had once defined the empire. And as these rebellions gained momentum, Nero's position became increasingly precarious, as he faced not only external threats but also the erosion of support within Rome itself. By the late 60s AD, the situation had reached a critical point, as multiple uprisings converged with political opposition, creating a scenario in which Nero could no longer rely on the loyalty of his allies or the strength of his authority to maintain control, and as news of revolts spread, the Senate, once hesitant to act directly against the emperor, began to distance itself from him, ultimately declaring him a public enemy, a decision that effectively marked the end of his reign, and in response, Nero fled Rome, seeking refuge as the structures of power that had sustained him collapsed, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. And in this final phase, the contrast between the image he had cultivated and the reality of his situation became starkly apparent, as the emperor who had once commanded the vast resources of an empire now faced the prospect of defeat, abandonment, and the end of his life. As the final phase of Nero's reign unfolded, the structures that had once supported his authority began to collapse with increasing inevitability, revealing the fragility of power when it is sustained more by fear than by loyalty. And as rebellions spread across the provinces, the emperor found himself facing a crisis unlike any he had encountered before, one that could not be resolved through spectacle, artistic performance, or political maneuvering, because this time, the threat was not confined to whispers within the Senate or isolated conspiracies, but had taken the form of open defiance, led by military commanders and governors who controlled real armies and commanded real allegiance. And among these figures was Gaius Julius Vindex, a governor in Gaul who openly rebelled against Nero's rule, criticizing his financial policies and calling for change. And although Vindex himself would not ultimately succeed, his actions ignited a chain reaction that would prove far more dangerous than any single revolt, as it encouraged other leaders to challenge the emperor's authority, including Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania, who declared himself a representative of the Roman people and positioned himself as an alternative to Nero's increasingly unstable leadership. At first, Nero attempted to respond as he had in previous crises, relying on the mechanisms of power that had once protected him, but the situation had changed, because the loyalty of the military, which had long been a cornerstone of imperial stability, was no longer guaranteed, and as support for Galba grew, Nero's position weakened further, particularly when the Praetorian Guard, the elite force responsible for protecting the emperor, began to shift its allegiance, a development that signaled a decisive turning point, because without the support of the Guard, Nero was effectively defenseless within his own capital, and as news reached Rome that Galba had been recognized as emperor by key factions, the Senate moved to formalize Nero's removal, declaring him a public enemy of the state, a designation that carried severe implications, including the prospect of execution, humiliation, and the complete destruction of his legacy. Faced with this reality, Nero made the decision to flee, abandoning the city that had once been the center of his world, and seeking refuge in the countryside, accompanied by a small group of loyal servants. And it was during this period of isolation that the full weight of his situation became clear, as the emperor who had once commanded vast resources and absolute authority now found himself without protection, without allies, and without a clear path forward. And according to historical accounts, Nero struggled to come to terms with his fate, oscillating between denial, despair, and moments of reflection, reportedly lamenting the loss of his position not in terms of political failure, but in terms of personal identity, expressing concern that the world was losing a great artist, a sentiment that, while seemingly disconnected from the gravity of his situation, reveals an important aspect of how Nero saw himself, not merely as a ruler, but as a performer, someone whose value was tied to expression, recognition, and legacy. As the forces loyal to the Senate and to Galba closed in, Nero's options became increasingly limited, and the prospect of capture raised the possibility of a humiliating execution, a fate that Roman tradition reserved for those deemed enemies of the state. And in an attempt to avoid such an end, Nero resolved to take his own life. But even in this final act, he hesitated, reportedly unable to carry out the deed on his own, and it was ultimately with the assistance of a servant, Epaphroditus, that he completed the act, ending his life on June 9, 68 AD, at the age of 30, bringing an end not only to his reign, but also to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since the time of Augustus. And with his death, the empire entered a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a time of rapid succession, conflict, and uncertainty that underscored the consequences of Nero's and the fragility of imperial continuity. In the immediate aftermath of his death, efforts were made to erase Nero from the historical record through the practice of damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of memory that sought to remove all traces of a disgraced ruler, including the destruction of statues, the removal of names from inscriptions, and the rewriting of official records. And while such measures were intended to eliminate Nero's presence from history, they ultimately proved only partially successful, because the scale of his actions, the intensity of his reign, and the dramatic nature of his story made it impossible to fully erase him, and instead, Nero became a figure shaped as much by narrative as by fact, his image evolving over time through the accounts of historians, writers, and cultural interpretations. Ancient sources, particularly those written by historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, played a significant role in shaping the traditional view of Nero as a tyrant, emphasizing his excesses, his cruelty, and his alleged role in events such as the Great Fire of Rome. And yet it is important to recognize that these accounts were written after his death, often during periods when it was politically advantageous to portray him negatively, raising questions about the extent to which these narratives reflect objective reality versus retrospective interpretation. And in recent centuries, historians have revisited these sources with a more critical perspective, considering the possibility that Nero's actions may have been exaggerated, misrepresented, or interpreted through the lens of political bias. And while this does not absolve him of responsibility for controversial decisions, it does suggest that his legacy is more complex than a simple characterization as either a mad tyrant or a misunderstood ruler. One of the most enduring aspects of Nero's legacy is the question of the Great Fire of Rome, an event that remains surrounded by uncertainty, as no definitive evidence has ever been found to confirm his involvement. And while the image of Nero playing music as the city burned has become one of the most iconic representations of indifference and decadence in history, it is widely regarded by modern historians as a symbolic narrative rather than a factual account, reflecting broader concerns about leadership and responsibility rather than a documented reality. And in this sense, Nero's story illustrates how historical figures can become larger than life, their identities shaped not only by their actions, but by the interpretations and stories that emerge over time. At the same time, it is important to consider the broader context of Nero's reign, including the social, economic, and political factors that influenced his decisions, as well as the challenges inherent in governing an empire as vast and complex as Rome, because while his personal behavior and choices undoubtedly contributed to the controversies surrounding his rule, they were also part of a larger system in which power was concentrated, accountability was limited, and the line between leadership and self-interest was often blurred, and in this environment, the distinction between a capable ruler and a destructive one could depend as much on perception and circumstance as on individual intent. Nero's interest in the arts, for example, while criticized by his contemporaries, can also be seen as an attempt to redefine the role of the emperor, to move beyond traditional expectations and explore new forms of cultural expression, and while this approach ultimately conflicted with Roman values and contributed to his downfall, it also highlights the tension between innovation and tradition, a tension that has characterized leadership in many different contexts throughout history, and similarly, his efforts to rebuild Rome after the fire, including the implementation of new building regulations and urban planning measures, demonstrate a level of administrative response that is often overshadowed by the narratives of excess and extravagance, suggesting that his reign cannot be understood solely through the lens of failure. In the centuries following his death, Nero's image continued to evolve, appearing in literature, art, and popular culture as a symbol of decadence, corruption, and the dangers of absolute power, and his story has been retold in countless forms, each interpretation reflecting the values and concerns of the time in which it was created, and this enduring presence speaks to the power of his narrative, a story that resonates not only because of its historical significance, but because of the questions it raises about leadership, responsibility, and the nature of power itself, questions that remain relevant even in the modern world. Ultimately, Nero's life represents a convergence of ambition, circumstance, and perception, a case in which the boundaries between reality and narrative become difficult to separate, and while it may never be possible to fully determine the extent to which the stories surrounding him reflect historical truth, his impact on the Roman Empire and on the broader course of history is undeniable, and in examining his reign, we are reminded that history is not simply a record of events, but a complex interplay of actions, interpretations, and memory, shaped by those who lived it and those who later sought to understand it, and in this sense, Nero remains not only a figure of the past, but a subject of ongoing reflection, a reminder of how power can shape both reality and the stories that endure long after the events themselves have passed.